Okay, so the fallopian tubes, also called the uterine tubes, all right, they sit around, right, the ovaries, but they do not directly connect to the ovaries. And so that's something really important to keep in mind. Okay, so they do not directly connect to the ovaries. Okay. They kind of just lay, like the end of the fallopian tube lays on top of the ovaries, but there's no direct connection. There's space between the fallopian tube where it connects to the ovary here, right, and the ovary itself, okay? And so let's talk about the different parts of the fallopian tube. So the first part closest to the ovary, those are called the fimbriae, okay? And so fimbriae are finger-like extensions. Okay, and so that's going to be these guys here. So they extend and kind of lay on top of the ovaries, and the epithelium on that fimbriae is covered in cilia. Okay, so they contain cilia, and what those cilia are going to do is they're going to beat, right, create movement. They're going to kind of wave and create movement, and that is going to create a current that is going to help to sweep that oocyte that's ovulated, that egg, into the fallopian tube. All right, to sweep egg into fallopian tube. Okay, and so the reason it's important to keep in mind that the fallopian tube is not directly connected to the ovary is that when an egg is ovulated, all right, it's released, it emerges from the ovary. Ideally, right, that current from the cilia is going to pull that egg into this fallopian tube, okay? But the egg is released into essentially the peritoneal cavity. So it is possible, although it's not extremely common, it's possible that that egg can fall out, not go into the fallopian tube, and end up in that peritoneal cavity. Okay, so the fimbriae with their cilia are there to kind of help guide that egg into the fallopian tube. All right. So then the next structure is called the infundibulum. The infundibulum is a cone-shaped structure, all right, that it extends from those fimbriae. Okay, and so it is open to the peritoneal cavity. All right, so open to the peritoneal cavity. Okay, and so here would be the infundibulum. All right, so the fimbriae extend off of the infundibulum. Okay, and so then the next portion is called the ampulla. All right, it's a widened region. Okay, and the ampulla is important because this is most often where fertilization occurs. All right, so this is where fertilization occurs. And so that would be here, all right? So fertilization typically occurs that far away from the uterus, all right? So the sperm have to swim all the way up through this fallopian tube, right, all the way out to the ampulla. Typically, fertilization occurs in the ampulla. Okay, and so then we have, just before the fallopian tube meets the uterus, we have the isthmus. So the isthmus is where the fallopian tube narrows, right? So it's a narrowing before the uterus, right? Connecting to the uterus. Okay, so the isthmus would be right here. Okay, and so I mentioned just a little while ago that it is possible for an egg to not make it into the fallopian tube, right? To be ovulated into the peritoneal cavity. And it is also possible that that egg becomes fertilized. That would lead to an ectopic pregnancy. Okay, so this would be when the egg is fertilized in the peritoneal cavity. Okay, and so that is possible because the fallopian tube does not form a direct connection over that ovary. So an egg can be ovulated and move into the peritoneal cavity. And so generally these ectopic pregnancies are not going to be viable, right? And that's just because the peritoneal cavity, it doesn't have the nutrients, right? It's not set up to support a developing embryo. Okay, so you don't have the nutrients and the blood supply and all that kind of stuff to support that developing embryo. So most often it is not viable. All right, so now let's just talk about briefly the mucosa or the histology in general of the fallopian tube. Okay. So the fallopian tube contains simple columnar cells, and as we mentioned, those simple columnar cells contain cilia. Okay, and so the cilia, again, beat, kind of like move to create a current, right? Like a whoosh kind of current to pull that egg along, right? So they function to move the ovum. All right, and these simple columnar cells also have mixed in a bunch of goblet cells. And those goblet cells are going to secrete mucus that is going to function to help nourish that ovum as it travels. All right, and then in addition to the mucosa, there is a layer of muscularis. That muscularis acts by peristalsis, all right, to kind of gently move that ovum forward towards the uterus. Okay. And then the fallopian tubes are intraperitoneal, so they're going to be surrounded by serosa. All right. So one final note before we move on to the uterus is that if fertilization occurs, it's going to, as we said, occur generally in the ampulla. Okay, and so once that ovum has been fertilized, right, now it's going to be a blastocyst, it is going to be moved, whoops, all right, by peristalsis and those cilia. Towards the uterus, okay? And that process takes between 4 and 6 days, which is why we need those goblet cells to nourish that ovum, that blastocyst, because it's going to spend 4 or 6, like between 4 and 6 days to actually reach the uterus where it can implant, and then it'll get all the nourishment it needs from the uterus. Okay. Good. All right, so now let's talk about the uterus. Okay, so with the uterus, just to kind of review, so we talked about some ligaments already, all right? So we have the broad ligament, which we mentioned before. With the ovary, it's that big sheet of connective tissue that connects the ovary with the fallopian tube and the uterus. We also have the round ligament. Okay, and so the round ligament is going to connect the uterus to the anterior abdominal wall. All right, so anterior abdominal wall. Okay, and it's responsible for holding the uterus in an anti-flex position. All right, so actually let me give myself a little space here. Okay, well, it is gonna hold the uterus antiflex. And I'll tell you what that means. All right, so it's going to hold the uterus in a position. So the uterus actually lays over, it kind of bends forward and lays over the top of the bladder. All right, and so it's held in that place, kind of anchored, kind of laying over the bladder. That's called antiflexed. All right, and it's held there by this round ligament. Okay, and so the round ligament on this picture would be here. All right, that would be the round ligament. And we talked about before, this would be the ovarian ligament here. We would have ligaments coming off here. That would be the suspensory ligament. And then we can see a little remnant here of that broad ligament, that big sheet of ligament. Okay? And then the last one to talk about is the uterosacral ligament. So we can't see it on this picture. All right, so we're just going to talk about what it does. So it just simply anchors the uterus to the sacrum, right? The posterior wall of the abdominal cavity. Right? So posterior wall / sacrum. Okay, so the name kind of tells you that uterosacral ligament, right? So that one's not too bad. Okay, and so then if we are looking, before we get into histology, let's just talk a little bit of anatomy. All right, so if we're looking at the uterus, we can point out some kind of different parts. So with the uterus, we have, I'm trying to figure out where to write this so I don't have any, like a bunch of lines crossing over each other. We'll put it up here. All right, so we have the cervix. All right, so the cervix is going to be here. So the cervix is the kind of inferior boundary of the uterus. All right, and so then the cervix has these kind of indentations here and here. So on either side, those are called fornix, right? So that would be the fornix, where it's indented on either side of the uterus. And then we move up to the uterus. So we have kind of the main part of the uterus here is called the body. All right, I'll just kind of write that here. So the body of the uterus. All right, and then we have the fundus of the uterus is kind of this top part, and it's the fundus that again is antiflex, right? So it's going to fold forward over the bladder. Okay, all right, so now let's talk histology and kind of like layers of the uterus. All right, and so we're going to start from the outside and work our way in. All right, so the outermost portion of the uterus is called the perimetrium. All right, and this is going to be a serous membrane on the outside. All right, so the perimetrium is a serous membrane on the outside. Okay, so it would be out here, right, if we're looking at our uterus. All right, and then the next layer in is this huge, thick layer of smooth muscle. That is called the myometrium. All right, so the myometrium is smooth muscle. Okay, and it's a very, very thick layer of muscle. The muscle moves in many directions, right, because it's not just circular and longitudinal like we've had before with other organs. It's going in many directions. And it functions in delivery. All right, so it contracts during birth. All right. So contracts during delivery. Okay. So we have a really thick layer of smooth muscle. That's the myometrium. And then the innermost layer, kind of like the equivalent to the mucosa, all right, that contains the epithelium, is called the endometrium. Okay, so the endometrium we can break down into two separate layers. Although, if you're looking at a histology slide, you typically can't, there's no very clear dividing line between these two layers. We'll talk about how you can tell them apart, but there's two definitely distinct parts of the endometrium. So the innermost that would contain the epithelium is the stratum functionalis, and so it contains simple columnar tissue, and the lamina propria underneath it, right? And so it's a pretty thick layer of lamina propria. And we can tell that we're looking at the stratum functionalis when we're talking about the menstrual phase. And that's because this is the layer of the endometrium that is shed during menstruation. All right, so it's very clear during the menstrual phase which layer is functionalis and which one is basalis. Okay, and so basalis is underneath it, and it remains during menstruation. All right, so this is the layer that is not shed, and then its function is to replace that functionalis that was shed. All right, so it is going to be undergoing lots of mitosis in order to replace the functionalis after menstruation. All right. So then inside of this endometrium, there's going to be a bunch of glands. These glands are called endometrial glands. Excuse me. All right. So endometrial glands are just going to be folds of the endometrium, and they're going to secrete different nutrients and things that will support the blastocyst if it implants, all right, the developing embryo. Okay, all right, so that's the histology of the uterus. Now let's talk about the uterine cycle. Okay, so with the uterine cycle, it's broken into 3 different phases, all right? And they do correspond to some events in the ovarian cycle. All right, so the uterine cycle, sometimes it's also called the menstrual cycle. And so this just involves the thickening and then the shedding of the functionalis layer, right? The endometrium of the uterus. Okay, so the first phase is menstruation. So we start with menstruation. That's day 1 through 5. And as we said with menstruation, that functionalis, the stratum functionalis, is going to be shed. All right, so we can see here, right, this functionalis is shed. And so then here we're just left with basalis, right? So at the end of the menstrual phase, right, that's where we would be here with just basalis left. All right, so then we would start the proliferative phase. So this would be from day 6 to day 14. And during this phase, that functionalis is being replaced by the basalis. Okay, so that would be here. So we're going to be replacing, this basalis is going to be working hard to replace that missing functionalis. Okay, and so that's going to be from there until about right here. All right, and you can see in this picture we have, these are the endometrial glands that they're showing here, these kind of yellow glands. Okay, so those are the endometrial glands. All right, so proliferative phase, we're going to be replacing that basalis, and so this is driven by the increase in estrogen. Now, where is that estrogen coming from? All right, remember that estrogen is from those follicular cells. Because at the same time, right, leading up to day 14, those follicles are developing, getting bigger, or getting more follicular cells, and so they're going to be producing more and more estrogen. So that estrogen is going to stimulate this proliferative phase, right? The production of the replacing of the functionalis. Okay, and so think of it as this is basically preparing for ovulation, right, and possibly receiving a fertilized egg, right? So that endometrium needs to be prepared to receive a fertilized egg. Okay. All right, so the proliferative phase, and then we have the secretory phase. Okay, and so with the secretory phase, this is going to be from day 15 to 28. All right, so that's after ovulation. All right, and after ovulation, that functionalis is going to start to thicken. and it's going to increase its blood supply, right? So we can see in the picture we have a bunch of blood vessels, right? These glands are going to start secreting mucus, right? So they start to get really squiggly when they do that. So when they become more active, they get very wavy instead of just being like nice and straight up and down, right? So the endometrial glands start to secrete, the blood supply increases, and that's all associated with that secretory phase, right? And that's going to be preparation for a possible fertilized ovum, okay? And so that is going to be in response to progesterone, right? Whoops. And that comes from the corpus luteum. All right, so that corpus luteum producing progesterone. Remember, we said the function of progesterone is to maintain that uterine lining. All right, so it helps to kind of enrich that uterine lining too in preparation for a possible embryo. All right, so it enriches it with blood and secretions. And then if the egg is fertilized, all right, we'll maintain that uterine lining by continuing to produce progesterone. Okay, so let's talk about what actually happens if the egg is fertilized. Okay, so if fertilization occurs, the blastocyst is going to implant in that endometrium. When it implants, it releases a hormone called beta-HCG. All right, that's actually the hormone that pregnancy tests will test for. Okay, and so beta-HCG, I've got the yawns this morning, I'm sorry. Beta-HCG is going to act on the corpus luteum to tell it to continue making progesterone. All right, so then this will help to maintain that uterine lining. Whoops. Uterine lining. Okay, because if beta-HCG weren't produced, all right, that progesterone production from the corpus luteum would stop, right? The corpus luteum would become a corpus albicans. It would stop producing progesterone, all right? And then we would enter this menstrual phase here, right, where we shed that functionalis layer. So since fertilization has occurred, the blastocyst has implanted, we don't want to go through that menstrual phase and shed that uterine lining. And so that's why beta-HCG kind of tells the corpus luteum to keep making progesterone. Okay? All right, and so that will occur for the first 3 months of pregnancy. The corpus luteum will be making progesterone until the placenta can kind of take over the necessary functions. It's formed and it can take over. Okay. All right, so that's if fertilization occurs. All right, and so then also relating to the uterine cycle is menarche. So menarche is just a term referring to when the ovarian and uterine cycles start. All right, so this would be like a girl's first menstruation. All right, that's referred to as menarche. Okay. All right, so that's the uterus and the uterine cycle. So let's just talk about the few remaining structures associated with the female reproductive system. All right, so if we continue from the uterus, right, we would reach after the cervix, right, and the cervical os. So the cervical os is the opening to the cervix, is the vagina, okay? So this cavity here, that would be the vagina. All right, it's inferior to the uterus. As I said, there's the fornix. So the fornix is this recessed region, this kind of indentation here. Here, I'll label that since I have a little more room on this picture. All right, so it's the fornix, is the indentation. And then the cervix would be here. And then the vagina would be here. Okay. All right, and so then a structure associated with the vagina is the hymen. This is just a very thin tissue layer that covers the opening to the vagina. All right, and so the hymen tears very easily. All right, so it can tear. So it is infamous for being known that it can tear after the first intercourse, but it can also tear in response to strenuous physical activity, use of menstrual products like tampons, and after physical examination from a doctor. All right. So it can tear. Generally, it's associated with the first intercourse. All right, but it can tear for many other reasons as well. Okay, so now let's talk about the histology of the vagina. All right, so the mucosa of the vagina, mainly what you guys should know about it is that it does contain rugae. All right, so it contains folds that allow it to stretch. Particularly important is that it be able to stretch during childbirth, right? So that's why we have rugae in the vagina. It also, that mucosa tends to be very acidic. That helps to reduce, bacteria, kind of keeps bacteria under control, because obviously you don't want an infection moving up from the vagina all the way up to the uterus, okay? So it helps to control bacteria. All right. And then the vagina also has a layer of muscularis, okay? So that muscle can contract. We'll talk about contraction during intercourse, but also during childbirth, right? And then the vagina would be surrounded by adventitia. Okay. Now the external genitalia, all right, also called a vulva. Okay, so we're going to start with the labia majora. So the labia majora are a structure in females that is homologous to the scrotal sac in males, right? So homologous just means that it has the same developmental origin, right? Just in males, it develops into a scrotal sac. In females, it becomes the labia majora, all right? And the labia majora is going to enclose the vestibule, okay? And so the vestibule is also bordered by the labia minora. So let's see, we can label some of this on the picture. All right, so labia majora are on the outside, right? So that would be labia majora. And then labia minora would be on the inside here, okay? And so they're going to border the vestibule. And so then the vestibule, what that refers to is the urethra, the vagina, and the clitoris, all right? So the openings for each of those. So we have the opening for the vagina would be here, right? The opening for the urethra would be anterior to that here. And then the clitoris would be anterior to that here, okay? And so those three structures make up the vestibule, and they are surrounded by the labia, so the minora and the majora, okay? And so the clitoris, since we haven't talked about it yet, right? So the clitoris is a homologous structure to the male penis, okay? So it actually does contain erectile tissue, okay? And it is covered by a little kind of layer of skin called the prepuce. And so this would be analogous or homologous to the male foreskin, okay? So the clitoris contains erectile tissue during intercourse, right? That tissue actually does fill with blood, right? Become erect, very similar to the male penis, okay? All right. And so then there are a couple glands associated with the external genitalia. So we have the paraurethral gland. This is kind of the female version of the prostate. It secretes during intercourse, all right? And so it is also responsible for female ejaculation, which is possible. All right, and then there's the Bartholin's gland, all right, and they make mucus. So this would be similar to the male Cowper's glands, which we'll talk about in the next lecture. All right, they're going to secrete mucus that's going to function in lubrication. Okay. All right, so that's the external genitalia, and then we're just very briefly going to talk about the mammary glands. Okay, so the mammary glands contain primarily adipose tissue, all right, and then there's going to be obviously milk-producing glands in that adipose tissue, mixed in with the adipose tissue. It's going to be anchored to the pectoralis muscle, all right, and then in each of the breasts, there's going to be 15 lobes with milk-secreting glands, all right, and so those glands are going to secrete into lactiferous ducts. These are going to be surrounded by smooth muscle to help kind of eject that milk that's being produced. All right, and then we've mentioned lactation. We've mentioned a couple hormones in the endocrine chapter. All right, and so we have prolactin, which is responsible for milk production and maintaining milk production. And then we have oxytocin, which is responsible for the letdown reflex. Okay, so when breastfeeding actually occurs and a baby starts to suckle, oxytocin will be released, and that will release the milk for the